Thank you everyone to join the Renewable Energy Financing Roundtable. Remember, you can send questions for the Q&A section. Maria Neto is Executive Director of the Institute for the Climate and Society. Hello, Maria. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Also, Elizabeth Robberechts, sorry for the pronunciation, is a Managing Director and Division Chief of Infrastructure and Energy of the IDB Invest, part of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. Hello, Elizabeth.
Good morning.
Thank you very much. And Carlos Barrera, the host, CEO of Atlas Renewable Energy, a leading energy company with operations in the Americas. Hello, Carlos. Hello, Ucho.
Hey, Mariano. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, thank you very much. We have many questions, many points to discuss, but I would like to have an introduction with some general questions to start this roundtable. And so we can have an outlook of what it means renewables energy in Latin America. I would like to start with Maria Neto, if it's all right for you. So if you can provide us some context on the impact of renewables in the region, their share in total generation of electrical energy, how much they have grown in recent times, future projections, what challenges they have. So Maria, if you can help us with an outlook of what it means renewables in Latin America.
Thank you so much, Mariano, for the opportunity to be here. To say renewables in Latin America, obviously Latin America is a big region. So sometimes, if we consider Mexico to Argentina, we are going to see different shares of the renewables. But let's say in a very broad manner, first of all, the renewable energy in the South America, to start with, is the majority in almost all countries of the electricity energy produced, right? And so the South American region has a huge potential historically already, been relying a lot on renewables, particularly hydropower historically, but more recently, more and more on solar and wind power. And we do have countries that are quite, emblematic with regards to that historically, such as the case, for example, of Chile, that has done a lot in terms of increasing its potential of both wind and solar, for instance, as well as historically Brazil, Colombia, for example, with the hydropower, and more recently expanding also a lot wind and solar. But even Mexico, that still relies on a mix of energies, relying more on gas, has been historically very important in bringing and scaling renewables. In particular, the wind power was one of the first countries in the region to promote that. So I would say, first of all, with the alternative renewables, the region is a region that has been very important for these technologies, has been using these technologies for a while, and has been moving over the last years on quite sophisticated markets where most of the generation is also privatized, okay? We have, of course, exceptions, countries like Venezuela that are complex and so on, but if we want to generalize, that's an important message. The other thing that is important is that more recently, what we see as opportunities with this renewable already comparative advantage that the region has is also that the region has a lot of opportunity with mining in terms of lithium and other rare earths that are very important for the future of those energies. A big problem that the whole region still has is that although it is generating a lot of energy, it does not have yet very sophisticated and, let's say, smart transmission lines. It needs to invest still a lot in improving its grid transmission lines, and also it should and need to work more and more on batteries and storage, given that the reliance on hydropower, unfortunately, has been affected a lot by climate change. The case of Brazil is a very telling example where we did have traditionally a very, let's say, big share of the hydropower. And with the expansion of alternative energy, we could always have the situation of the hydropower allowing basically our renewable alternative expansion to happen because the hydropower would maintain the firm energy. But with the climate change, we are losing a lot of reliance on the hydropower because of the levels of water in the dams and having to rethink about the grid. So it started to become an important opportunity, but also a challenge for the region. No? And thinking about that, the region is one of the regions that has one of the largest potential of lithium in the world, with some countries like Bolivia being very emblematic. That brings a question also for the region on how we make better use of these commodities to also develop the technologies locally and create and attract investments that are not just about selling these products, but being able to have these technologies produced locally and aggregate value. Further, for even more, let's say, innovative renewable energy, for example, as the case of green hydrogen, given that we have this high potential already of renewables, we do have the opportunity of very quickly being able to expand these new technologies. Clearly, these technologies still have problems of break-even. They are highly costly. They do need to have a level of demand that has to be high. But I think there are also very interesting examples in our region of some countries, like in the case of Chile I was mentioning, that took a lot of risks already at the beginning and decided to create innovative financial instruments to scale their capacity to become more competitive. In short, the region has a lot of comparative advantages. But the question is how this is going to become competitive, because we do have challenges towards the future. One is these transmission costs and the need to make them more efficient. And sometimes the efficiency of transmission, particularly now, for example, if you take the case of Central America, when I was working in IDB years ago, big problem is not effective if you are having just the transmission lines one country, country by country. If we were able to actually have transnational kind of transmission lines, it could be much more efficient. Sometimes the inability of collaborating or making these larger infrastructures more intelligent is a barrier for expansion and more efficient use of energy. So there is an opportunity, a lot of opportunities still on that, but also a challenge. And again, I think to make the comparative competitive, we also need to have better strategies that also need to be regional on how we are positioning the region as one of the regions that could attract investments, not just be selling commodities. Investments in, for example, storage, but also industries that could benefit from our renewables. We are in a world today where there is a lot of competitiveness for energy supply, and a lot of opportunities could also be what we call power shorting, or to bring the industries to produce where the energy is cleaner and cheaper. We do have in many of the countries in the region the opportunity of offering this kind of attraction for investments that could be producing hard to abate, high costly dependent energy industry to benefit from our energy excess, let's say, in renewables. But there is a big question on how to do that in a sophisticated manner that makes the investments truly attractive. And for that, you don't need only the energy per se, but the infrastructure around that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. That was great. Also, feel free to answer whenever you want, to interrupt me. Let's make something more spontaneous. That's okay for me. But I will go now with Elizabeth. If you can give us some numbers to understand the role of renewables in the region from a financial perspective. And also, Maria talked about many challenges and bottlenecks in the industry. Also want to ask if financial is a challenge for renewables in Latin America.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mariano. I appreciate very much the invitation to be part of this panel, the roundtable. well, in IDB is, of course, a multilateral development bank, and IDB Invest is the private sector part of that group. So we are at IDB Invest, just to give the audience background, financing projects, providing different types of financial instruments to support all kinds of infrastructure projects, but a lot of energy projects with a real focus, of course, on renewable energy. And we have financed many gigawatts of solar projects, wind projects, hydropower projects, geothermal projects, waste to energy, all different types of energy projects in the region. And I think the growth has been much more rapid than was expected, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when I arrived in Chile. I was in Chile for a while, along with Ucho for a while, and there were a few projects and their projections of growth. There was a lot of optimism for growth, but there were very few projects operating, and no one imagined the level of growth that would have taken place by now. It has really been, I think, beyond the expectations of that time. And of course, with solar, I think leading the way in many of the countries, a lot of this driven by auction processes in Chile, in Brazil, in Colombia, and that have been very successful, and in other countries. Different types of regulatory frameworks have also included different types of subsidies, feed-in tariffs. You have a number of countries that have made possible private to private PPAs, which have really been important in growing renewables in certain countries, particularly in Brazil. We've seen quite a bit of that. So there are all kinds of modalities being used. The limiting factor that we have seen most recently is related to transmission, as Mario had said, that there are many projects that are, there's just not sufficient transmission to deliver the energy, particularly given the certain times of day when it's being generated. And so the next discussion has been related mostly to storage, and what kinds of storage technologies and battery systems can be implemented. And regulatory frameworks are evolving to take that into account. I think we've seen, once again, Chile leading the way with their 2022 law that has been promoting the use of battery systems. I think some countries have struggled with how to treat the battery systems, whether they treat them as transmission assets or treat them as generation assets, and that's kind of slowed down some of the regulatory frameworks being put in place. But the natural incentive has been there for companies for developers and project owners to incorporate battery systems and store some of the energy that they produce so that they can sell it at night at a higher price. So the arbitrage incentives are there for sure, but the regulatory frameworks, I think, are also coming not only for projects that are kind of hybrid projects, solar plus storage, but also for standalone storage projects, which we see growing quite a bit. In terms of what a multilateral development bank can do, I think starting with what IDB is doing and what Maria mentioned, this kind of regional integration and trying to promote transmission is very complex because it involves long areas of land and rights of way and things like that become difficult to put in place. And so having collaboration between countries is really critical. We've seen some of that happening between Colombia and Panama, between Peru and Ecuador. We've seen some examples of that, Belize and Mexico, happening more and more, these kind of regional integration. The CPAC line, obviously, through Central America is another example, but IDB is playing a role given the relationships that we have with so many governments in trying to promote regional integration. And also in financing the projects themselves. We have a lot of products and we can use resources from donors to incentivize companies to put the battery projects, the battery components into their projects and absorb that additional cost so they can still reach the levels of profit that they're looking for. So lots of different roles that we're playing, all the way from relationships with the governments to providing the actual financing to make these projects happen.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. The reason I decided to end this introduction with Carlos is because now it will be great to have the point of view of a company after all this outlook. And I would like, Carlos, if you can introduce Atlas to all of us. What is the capacity of Atlas? What are the projects of Atlas in Latin America, in the region? And also, one more question, if you can tell us what financing tools have you found in the last years, and which financial tools do you see for the next years to develop the projects of Atlas? Thank you, Carlos.
Sure. No, thank you, Mariano. Pleasure to be here. Look, Atlas is a pan-regional Latin America renewables IPP. So we're based in mainly Chile, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia. We also have a position in Uruguay, and we're really focused on working with large corporates that are looking to make an energy transition and supporting them with renewable power and really kind of clean energy solutions. And we aim to do that in a very sustainable manner, actually. As of now, we will be ending the year with about 5 gigawatts of solar PV and BESS installations operating. And then we have a big sort of pipeline going forward. So as of today, we're really the biggest solar and BESS player in the region. Maybe first, just to not to really kind of repeat a lot of what's been said, so clearly renewables is still dominating in the region. It's been dominating for some years, probably north of 80% or so of new capacity installations across LatAm are renewables, or mainly solar and wind. So it's been a huge amount of growth, as Elizabeth said, for many, many years, and that continues. I think interestingly, there's a bit of a shift in narrative globally around prioritizing, let's say, reliability, right, over some of the climate concerns. Certainly, we've seen that in the U.S. administration. We've also seen parts of that, perhaps elsewhere. But I think that's really not slowed down in any way the uptake of renewables elsewhere. And I think our conversations with different corporations indicate the same. I think there's a lot of interest in continuing down the path of more renewables. It's the lowest cost resource. It's the fastest deployment, and it's the lowest risk development. I think to get into different technologies, more conventional technologies, implies greater risk. And so, that kind of the landscape, right? Even like these international tariffs, right, which have obviously been problematic in certain areas, cause a lot of noise for sure. That really, again, hasn't impacted the renewable sector in LatAm in a material way. Certainly, volatility changes in cost of capital that has international implications for investors. But again, no sort of direct impact in the renewables sector on the tariff side in LatAm. So I think the industry is a little insulated from all that in LatAm, and the issues that we're seeing, I think, were mentioned, are really more local around transmission constraints. Sometimes it's transmission constraints. Sometimes it's a bit of overbuild of solar. So sometimes you have excess generation as well. And how that sort of really manifests is in the form of curtailments, right? So you've had on the sort of large scale installations, a lot of growth, as was mentioned before, but then you've also had the emergence of DG, in different areas, in different countries. And that's really exacerbated the amount of power that's available during daytimes in certain jurisdictions. And so the effect of all these things combined is really heavy curtailments, which has really been problematic for the sector. Depending on kind of the local dynamics and local laws in some jurisdictions, in some areas, it's more problematic than others. Depending how projects are structured, it's more problematic than others. But I think that is really kind of the key thing, right? And again, there's a big piece of that is transmission as well. So I think this exciting new trend of BESS is really important. And I think Chile leading the way has kind of showcased how interesting that can be also from an investor perspective. You have a significant amount of international investors, of local investors that have really, been taking positions in that sector now. or subsector, let's say. And again, it's been enabled fairly recently by a very sharp reduction in costs. So that's really helping to strengthen grids, to reduce curtailments, which again is something that needs to happen. Back to your question on financing, we are always really looking for, how can we most efficiently structure our projects? We've worked a lot with the IDB, with Elizabeth, with other MLAs, also with private banks. But to be honest, we're not really seeing, for a properly structured project, I don't think we're seeing financing constraints. I think the key thing is, how do you structure the project, making sure that the specifics of the project are bankable, that they make sense, that the sponsor is adequate, that the client is credit worthy. That obviously the technical aspects of the project are structured adequately. So from that perspective, I think, we have seen shorter tenor financing become, as of recent, perhaps more attractive. But that's really case by case. And overall, if you have a project that's adequately structured, I think we see a lot of avenues for financing.
Thank you very much. I will agree with you, Carlos. Data centers and all the energy that will demand the artificial intelligence is now in discussion. Maria and Elizabeth, they already named some of the challenges, some bottlenecks. What do you think is needed to truly scale green data centers in Latin America? Infrastructure, regulation, financing, investments. What is needed, and what is the scale of this challenge? What it means, all the demand that the artificial intelligence will require?
For sure. Look, I think there's a lot of things involved. That could be a very long answer, but I'll focus on a few. So the key thing for the data center companies is really access to power, reliable power. That it sounds simple, but it's that reliability, depending on the type of data center, has to be very, very high grade. It has to be very, very again, depending on the AI center, it's the amount of availability that's needed of that has to be 99.99999%, or if it's not that much, it's still very, very high. So I think that's a key thing. I think if you look at some of the areas where this is being deployed, I think we actually fit the bill in LatAm for that. I think there are areas that the grid is actually quite reliable. But that is a key thing. And so I think we need to demonstrate to these hyperscalers and other investors that the areas that are apt to be able to kind of build out data centers have this feature. Number two, I would say you have access to fiber, access to their sort of transmission. So our transmission is power. Their transmission is being able to transmit data. And so I think you need broad plans to expand fiber optic cables and an ability to transmit data, in a very significant amount. And so those are really the two main ingredients, right? Access to water sometimes may be needed. The newer data centers may need less of that. And I think there's an overall element of really speed. There's obviously in the OECD market, certainly in the US, there's a big race between the big hyperscalers to deploy, to get access to that energy, to kind of build out their positions. And so I think in some of the markets we have in LatAm, you certainly have permitting constraints. You have certain permits that just require a significant amount of time. And so we got to smarten up. And we need to create conditions here that allow some of the permits to happen quickly. And so, we may want to have, kind of pre-approved corridors for data centers in different areas that, at least in those areas, the local sort of situation has been properly vetted, and therefore you can deploy data centers at a much faster rate. And I think that's really where I think the region needs to smarten up in a big way. A lot of the data center companies are very much focused on the US right now, but I think over the next 2 to 3 years, and this is the information we get from our clients, from the data center companies, we will see a much bigger boom across LatAm. Bear in mind, LatAm has, 750 million people. A lot of the countries are very industrialized. If you look at Brazil, you look at Mexico, you look at Chile, look at many others, very, very industrialized. And so you're going to see huge local demands for that kind of technology. And so on the back of that, we will see, I think, a lot of deployment in data center.
Thank you. So, Maria, from a climate perspective, what is the view on all the energy that data centers require and will require in the next years?
I think it's not necessarily just from a climate point of view, Mariano, but it's also about the questions we were talking before, like when we talk about increasing the use of energy locally, and the data centers can be an opportunity, but also a challenge, because as Ucho was saying, you need to have local infrastructure, there will be requirements of water, and you are competing with local demand for energy. Right. So the question is, on this side, you need to have the good conditions locally for scaling any potential in terms of generating more energy and also bringing new investments. The second question that I think is an important question to ask ourselves is, how many jobs, value chains, and local opportunities are those investments creating? And I think this is a very important question to be asked when we bring any new investments. There might be investments that bring more opportunities in terms of aggregated value chains than others. So the question also, when we talk about the data centers, is going to be, are we looking at opportunities that these data centers can bring to the local economies beyond just the usage of energy and paying for the energy and increasing the energy generation? Or are we also thinking about, digitalization, access to services that could be used by the local countries that are offering the energy for that? So I think the discussion needs to be put a bit in this kind of context. In terms of climate change, I think, as mentioned, is very important for the region to continue to be competitive in renewables, to look more and more, in my view, not necessarily on the cost of financing, as Ugo was saying, the actual generation of energy per se, because of most of the countries are privatized sector, and they do have most of cases already technologies that are not as expensive and are proved technologies. I think the big challenge is to develop the infrastructure around the renewables that make them competitive. Just to give a very specific example, if you look at the case of Brazil, we do have excess renewables in the northeast of the country, but the tariff of energy for the end user is still very high, because our transmission lines have need for improvement, because we need some improvements also on how the electricity grid regulation needs to be addressed. And so the issue of curtailment is an issue that we need to consider. And also, if we look only at adding demand to energy without looking at these more kind of structural approaches, it may not be as efficient. So we need to have a vision of local development and a vision of what is needed to make more competitive and not just a comparative advantage to bring these new investments. No, so that would be a bit my point on the issue of the data centers. Can be an opportunity, but can be a challenge as well, depending a lot on how you frame it.
Thank you, Maria. Ucho.
Yeah, let me just jump in there. Look, I agree completely with Maria. I think both points. A more structural, integrated planning of this is very important, right? And is very needed to really attract that kind of investment and to make sure that the planning of that is adequate and it can be efficient. So I completely agree with that. Otherwise, it's bespoke, and I think that has a different set of challenges that are harder to manage, right? And I also agree with the point that the cost is critical. Now, I do want to add one point, which I think is really, really important. The hyperscalers are focused right now on the U.S. The U.S. right now, for incremental capacity, like 24/7 type energy demand, you're looking at about $100 or so per megawatt hour. And the reality is, there's a shift, right, towards trying to look for more gas or other solutions. To get a new gas turbine, you're looking at 2031. There's just a shortage of gas turbines. And so they're owned by some private equities that have taken positions, but they're very, very expensive. And so if you want to get a new gas turbine at a reasonable price, you're really waiting a long time. And so with all the tariffs as well that are affecting some of the battery imports into the US, it's become quite challenging, right, to really secure attractive pricing in the US. If you look at Chile, the pricing is closer to $50, $55 a megawatt hour, $60 a megawatt hour. So I think that point is often missed. I think the opportunity in LatAm for data centers can be very efficient. And the key thing is finding the right kind of structure of that investment, the right sponsors, the right stakeholders to be able to put something together that is very competitive. But I think that's an important point to highlight.
Thank you very much, Ucho and Elizabeth. Also, if you have anything to add on this topic, but also in giving us an overview of the financial context, the access, the liquidity for companies in this industry would be great.
Sure. And I'm sorry, everything went black here in my computer, so I had to reconnect. But I mean, for us, another topic that we've heard, in addition to the energy issue, is of course the water issue that has come up and becomes quite an important social issue. There are a couple projects in Uruguay, canceled because of water more than I think of power. And so there, I think as the technology develops to try to, use different types of cooling, that could open up a number of corridors, as Ucho said, that could be more, designated for these types of projects. I tend to agree that a well-structured project will find financing, and that these projects, given the rate of growth of energy demand, and particularly in this area, there's only going to be more renewable energy that's going to be dedicated to these types of projects. For us, I think we see our added value and more in dealing with the environmental and social aspects of the projects rather than the actual financing of a well-structured project, and so that's where we think our expertise can come in and help manage and give governments advice on how to manage that the best. But, it's definitely a sector, I agree totally, with huge potential in the region.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We're having through, thank you for everyone that is joining this roundtable, and also let you know that you can send some questions for the Q&A section at the end of the conversation. You can send the questions in the bottom right of your screen. Thank you very much. And also, we have been talking about many bottlenecks, the grid transmission, etc. What about regulations? What about the conversation with the public sector, with the politics? For example, in Argentina, is my case, the law of renewables was really important to make accelerating this industry to grow up almost sometimes in the 20% of the generation of electric energy in Argentina. But how important looking forward is a conversation between the politics, I don't know if Maria, you want to start with this, and then Ucho.
Yeah, sure. I think politics have a lot of role to play, and for sure regulation as well, Mariano. For instance, as I was mentioning, in the case of Brazil, there is some problems with regards to the tariffs that are more around how the tariffs are designed than the fact that the energy is cheaply produced. And some of the ways also the concessions were structured, for example, for transmission lines, make that it's very costly to renew them, but we should do that. And further, for example, we may need to have, and there is regulation being discussed, to allow and make it more efficient, the possibility for example, local transmission lines, or as I was mentioning, the issue of producing or promoting development of local value chains for batteries and storage, which is a very important area, as I mentioned, that the region does not have as yet as well developed. The issue maybe traditionally is that, and I can say even for my case where I used to support financing these projects in the past in IDB, that we used to look a lot at the amount of energy we need to produce and looking at capacity installed. But more and more, we need to look at those things as more systemic and complete development opportunities. So it cannot just be the capacity, it has to be about also what around the capacity that is installed has in terms of local infrastructure, how this attracts local value chains, industries, what are the, again, transmission lines, considering the system kind of approach. If you have more vulnerability now, for example, to the hydro power, how you substitute that with the storage. So for me, a lot of the challenges or the opportunities as well in terms of regulation is how we consider these reforms in the system that are not just looking ad hocly to the different problems, but are looking at the issues as a whole that can unlock and facilitate modernization to take place. And yes, in some cases, revising and review concessions or some other ways that things happen. And sometimes politics can play a role. If you take large countries like Brazil, but also the case of Mexico, sometimes the position of the countries vis-a-vis how they see energy should be managed. And as Ucho was saying, you could have also a question of energy security being used as an argument to say we need to have the energy security first. You could go even to the wrong directions. For example, in Brazil, there is a lot of pressure now to start ensuring much more investments in gas, for example, as an alternative to renewables, because gas could be closer to where people are, for example, accessing energy. So while gas can be used indeed for transition, sometimes you could have push and pull reasons that are political and not necessarily the most technical. No? But I think the biggest challenge for us in terms of regulation and politics, if you want, is to start looking at those issues not only about as energy capacity, but as integrated approach to the overall development of the country in terms of the price, the access to energy cost, in terms of the opportunities of developing local value chains, in terms of the infrastructure that is needed around the generation of the energy.
Let me add to that. So for me, I think the reality is the grid and the electricity system is changing dramatically over a period of a couple of decades, right? From generation sources that are gas, that are coal, that are hydro, that behave a certain way, that their response times are a certain way, that the effect they have on the grid is a certain way. And that certain way, by the way, had been happening for many decades to a very different looking grid, a very different set of technologies that really make up the bulk of that grid. And that's all the stuff we've been talking about, solar, wind. You have different forms of that. You have some residential, you have the DG, the regulation for that is actually different than some of the other forms. You have the large scale stuff. Now you have the onset of batteries. And so I agree with what Maria is saying, right? You need a very structural look at what does that imply, because it's a totally different set of attributes that come with that grid upgrade. And so I think that is the main issue that we're seeing right now that needs to be solved. That's why we keep talking about transmission, because one of the requirements of this new system is more transmission, but there's many others, right? And I think there's, again, BESS is a good thing. So this will help alleviate some of the stresses that are caused by that. But I think that is the challenge, right? And I think there's aspects of that that are, more advanced in certain countries. We talked about Chile, the big boom in BESS on the back of coherent regulation. That's, laying out the ground rules for how you make investments in BESS, how that will be remunerated. It's encouraging that Brazil, Mexico, certain other countries are also starting to look at that very critically, and they see the need, right? And they're starting to come up with a regulatory framework that could make sense, and they're discussing that with the industry bodies. I think that is essential, because I think what we're seeing is, BESS can provide just huge benefits to this new type of grid. As I said before, given the cost reduction that BESS systems have had over the recent history, it's also a big commercial opportunity, right? To really, make energy cheaper, more efficient in the different places. So I think that's a big thing that I think the rest of LatAm really needs to get fast, right? Regulation on best. The other thing I would mention around regulation is, in the same way that you need certain infrastructure in this new paradigm, you also need, I think, a different way to operate the system. And so we need to, capacity build the ISOs, right? So that they don't operate the system as if there's a bunch of coal plants and gas plants operating all the time. Because the reality is they're operating less and less every year. And so there's a different set of rules that now will probably make more sense. And so, if they keep operating the way it was before, that's very inefficient. So I think we need to have a process in all the countries where we really upgrade the ISO's understanding of how to best manage that system. Those are the two main things I think we need.
Thank you, Joe. Elizabeth, I would like your point of view of this, but also just to remember everyone, please just send the questions in the Q&A box that you can find it in the 9 points in the bottom right of your screen. Thank you very much. Elizabeth.
Well, I mean, the impact of political forces on projects is sort of the story of my life, actually. So I have to say, it's like governments are sort of like the changes in governments from one administration to another can create this massive disruption in some of the targets that have been set and the regulatory frameworks that have been set. So it can be a very frustrating up and down sort of experience. But what we have seen from governments is just they're reacting to the demand. They're reacting to the brownouts and blackouts that they're facing. They're reacting to the fact that it's become a political issue. And of course, it's not that they want very quick solutions, for sure. And so it's you can perhaps see more, continuity between governments on, okay, let's continue to promote renewable energy growth because there is, a significant, this can be put in place quickly, and we can implement this and meet some of our needs for data centers, just for regular consumption, for many different reasons. And it doesn't have to conflict with other energy sources. It doesn't have to be, there doesn't have to be a big geopolitical debate about it. It's a good thing for many reasons. And it also, I think, helps to provide, when you combine it with the batteries, some stability. We have seen countries in the region where, very reliant on gas, where, you have energy volatility and the energy prices, very significant volatility in the energy prices being driven by that. And that creates, problems and governments trying to create regulations to fix those problems. And it just ends up being a big, very big, complex situation that, governments have to deal with, and from a regulatory perspective, that's difficult to do across different governments and over time. So, from our perspective, more renewable energy is a very positive thing for the region. The region has so much capacity, and we think that the governments, we see them, really implementing long-term policies to promote renewable energy. And yes, there is a lot of, political noise, but to the extent that those policies permit participation by the private sector, which can see the incentives. The private sector is a pure profit-seeking entity, right? So it can see those incentives and find them and take advantage of them consistently. That, to us, has been the driving force that helps kind of mitigate the impact of government regulatory changes, is just consistent private investment.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. We are running out of time, and we have many questions coming on. So thank you very much for everyone. So I will leave here two questions. You can take wherever you want of these two, and also take the opportunity for a last remark before the questions. So the two questions that are more of the Mariano Espina, the journalist, not the moderator, are this one. The first is I write a lot about the oil and gas sector, and at the recent CERAWeek conference, there was a sort of consensus in the industry that the energy transition goals are delayed. So I would like to know how true is that from your perspective, and how might it affect finding financing for renewable projects? And also, you talk about the opportunities that Latin America represents in terms of climate conditions or in goals. But what about geopolitics? What about China, United States, tariff? How that can impact in the business? So you can stop, Maria, if you want. One of the two questions, feel free to answer.
Challenging questions, but anyway, I think the region has a huge opportunity over the challenges, okay? So I'll maybe take the question you were talking about, China, US, the energy security kind of conversation. Yes, there is this energy security conversation. In the long run, though, all countries need nature resources, and we do have a lot of rare earth, as I was mentioning. And we do have a lot of part of the solutions that are also needed for renewable energy. And renewable energy worldwide will be needed for the kind of increased energy demand worldwide. And so that's why I was talking even about the power shorting, because the region, if it is strategic, beyond just thinking about increasing the supply of renewables or improving the transmission lines and so on, it should be seen that as a development opportunity also to attract actual investment. So it's not just about selling the minerals, but it's about being clever to negotiate that for example, construction of batteries, the storage, and so on can be used and done aligned to those competitive advantages we have with critical minerals. So I think we need to look at the future of renewables of the region as two things: the potential of the region to generate renewables and hence benefit new technologies like the case of green hydrogen and so on, but also because we do have the critical minerals and we could aggregate value to those rather than just be selling them out, right? And integrate this to the local actually provision of energy by attracting also investments. And that can be a great opportunity for countries such as China. In the case of Brazil, I don't know so much about US with 50% tariffs, but in any case, for other countries, maybe it can always be an opportunity for also bringing these technologies, be for the transmission, be for the battery, be for the generation, but also the investors, the investments of industries that can produce here and be connected to other value chains. And I think that can be a challenge, but can be turned in an opportunity because the region does have a competitive advantage with nature resources. Just on the oil and gas, I think the energy transition goals are delayed. And I would say, indeed, for me, the key here is how we can turn oil and gas in more investments for those, particularly, as I was saying, game-changing investments that could take place that are maybe needed for modernization, for innovation. So again, if we link the value chains, for example, Brazil is a big producer of minerals like iron for steel. If you aggregate the iron to green hydrogen and you can have, the iron with aggregated value being sold for green steel, even if the steel, for example, is fabricated somewhere else, for instance, you could have a lot of potential to scale the technology of green hydrogen. But you need still a lot of R&D for some of those technologies to pick up. And these R&D resources or these kind of shifts are things that we are not yet seeing at the scale that they could be happening. And when we talk about oil and gas, they could be a very important driver for technology investments and changes toward the energy transition for renewables. And I think this has not been explored enough. We always talk only about oil and gas in terms of alternatives, but if we assume that they will continue producing, how we look at that. And the other question I would bring that I think is important is the reliance of the region on royalties from oil and gas. And this is not a private sector issue. This is an issue of dependence of the budgets of the governments on that. Maybe critical minerals and other types of renewables can be opportunities also of new revenues and other ways to look at that. And in the case of Brazil, for instance, we see also opportunities, for example, of oil and gas to be, for example, drivers for refineries for sustainable aviation fuels or for biomethanol. That could be alternatives for emissions for shipping or aviation, where it could be a very important role also in terms of emissions reduction. So we clearly need a more proactive and a more innovative and clear proposal on what this transition means, beyond just the traditional discussion of saying producing less or more, because we know that in reality, that's not what is happening. Still, you could have a lot of more investments from profits in new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Ucho, I would like a comment about this.
Sure. Let me just add something. I mean, I alluded to it at the beginning, and it's that a bit more in line with your first point about the climate change goals and where's that going and has that all changed? I mean, as Maria said, no, we're not reaching the goals that were stated before. But again, I think there's also some reason for optimism as well. Yes, the world has shifted a little bit towards more kind of energy security capacity, right? Reliability. And so post-COVID, you had kind of a big movement really to go all in on climate change concerns and really try to change the whole energy paradigm. And obviously Europe took a massive lead on that. Then the Ukraine war happened, right? And people, suffered very, very high prices in December for energy. And so that was a bit of a reality check around, okay, these are some of the implications of doing this. And so some governments, took a different tack there and pivoted a little bit towards also some energy security. Obviously, the previous election in the US voted in an administration that is more, again, of that sort of mindset. And so okay, is that a setback? Perhaps, right? But at the same time, again, this industry has changed very quickly because of BESS. Because a few years ago, yes, it was already cheap, it was already cost efficient to do solar, to do wind, but it was energy only, right? It was only producing when the wind was blowing, when the sun was shining. It wasn't capacity. And what's happened now is, because of the scale of investments happening initially in EVs and now in power, that brought down the costs of batteries in a massive way. And it is a huge shift, because for some of these countries that are focused on energy security now, actually the way to do that is through renewables and storage. Because if you're producing gas, if you're producing oil, depending on what country you're in, you may be beholden to another country that holds those resources, right? And that's the reality for the majority of countries. And so this this new trend that we're seeing in renewables, I think, has the potential to make a massive impact. And the reality is, much like we're seeing in renewables now, where if you have subsidies or if you don't have subsidies, it's still the most efficient way to procure power. In the future, solar plus BESS, maybe wind in certain areas plus BESS, I think constitutes the same. So I think from a commercial standpoint, that's going to be the driver. And I think that's a much more powerful driver than a government regulation that may change in the next administration.
Thank you very much, Ucho. Elizabeth, would you like to finish with this conversation?
Well, I totally agree. It's kind of the kind of long-term perspective. Governments change. This is something that we see, and so we have to maintain, the course, in the sense of saying investment in this is important, and it is something that we certainly at IDB will continue to promote very vigorously. At the same time, I was at a conference recently where the point was made that in India, for example, even if they were able to build 3 times more wind and solar than they've built in the last ever in history, every year until 2031 or 2033, I think was the date. Even if they're able to do that, 3 times more than they've ever built in any year, every single year for the next 8 or 10 years, they still would need more gas because of the rate of demand of energy growth. There is no way to say that they will. There's just this driving demand that we have for energy, which to me is one of the bigger trends that is kind of like, I don't know, making the whole discussion of the geopolitical, kind of, it's relevant. We are very much, keen on promoting, as Maria said, investment locally in these value chains locally, and in promoting the renewable energy in the region. But at the same time, what we're seeing is just governments looking to increase energy supply because of the fact that there's so much demand taking place, and it's, limiting their economic growth if they don't have enough energy demand. So, on the side of, the multilateral development banks, I think IDB certainly will be continuing to support renewable energy in the region, and we'll see continued growth in that. And we're maintaining a long-term perspective on that and the importance of it. That will not, change, depending on the different governments that come and go. This is an important thing for the region, and we continue to promote it.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Let's go to the questions. We have many questions. First of all, I will start with Elizabeth from Latin Finance. How much investment is needed for Latin America countries to expand their renewable energy capacity in 2025, 2026? What financing mechanism could support this growth? It's a difficult story.
Yeah. Well, the numbers in terms of the exact dollar amounts, I'm not certain. There's, many gigawatts that are needed to be built in the region. The financing mechanisms, I think what we're seeing a lot of, and is, bringing in, institutional investors sort of that are looking for investments in these types of technologies, and that would include green investors in the area of long-term institutional investors, kind of small family investors, many different types of investors looking to take a part in this type of technology, these types of projects that have long-term sort of steady returns, and that's what we see as being a very critical point to meeting that financing gap in the region. There are many other different types of tools that are being used in terms of, risk mitigation. In certain countries, there's a lack of investment, I think, just because of the financial capacity of the off-taker, for example. And so, we're looking at ways in IDB where we can backstop the obligations of the off-taker to help promote the bankability of the projects themselves that have PPAs with the off-taker. So there are a lot of different financing mechanisms that we can use to help mitigate risk and provide financing that meet the needs of the projects over time. But ultimately, there doesn't seem to be, as Ucho said, a significant lack of financing at this point in many of the larger economies.
Thank you, Elizabeth. For Maria from Victoria, how to promote and accelerate effective cooperation among the region countries for an integrated, robust, and high-value deployment of green industries?
Yeah. That's a very good question, because I think, for example, as I was mentioning, the critical minerals, if one country, for example, sells the critical minerals, and it's very easy to do that, as a commodity, and don't negotiate very well the aggregated value, the next country that wants to do it may have less comparative advantage to do so. So I think there is opportunities also for the countries to, if they among themselves understand that jointly they gain more than just doing the typical commodity view of I sell it and that's all, it will obviously help. I think certainly organizations like IDB can be important, and other regional organizations, in helping some kind of common vision where aligned visions in terms of what can be the aggregated value is an opportunity. The other thing is, I think, also having ways of helping and working with local governments, sometimes for larger countries like Mexico, Brazil, can be even subnationals, right? to think about this planning in terms of how energy can be aggregated to value chains, trade, and so on, can be also an interesting way to promote collaboration. Because you can present the region in terms of comparative advantage and competitive advantage better by demonstrating, for example, look, you have these areas where the logistics are cheap, you have access to markets, you have cheap energy, you have the infrastructure to come and locate your industry locally. This kind of narratives is much easier to sell as a region than just as an isolated country. I was recently in an event with international sovereign funds, and I could see that Latin America was much less competitive just because of the way we don't present the region as an opportunity. We tend to just be presenting countries or specific things, whereas, for example, Asian countries are much better in this, to sell the region as an attractive region for businesses. No? So being able to articulate as a region also these kind of opportunities, it would be a very interesting way to promote better and attract investments to the region.
Thank you very much, Maria. We are running out of time. We are going to end with our last questions to Ucho. And what's about if you're planning to go to the markets in Atlas, you're planning bonds, green bonds, are you planning any financial tool for some project this year or next year?
Look, many. I mean, so we're constantly growing as a company in the different markets we're in, and so every time we find an opportunity, obviously we look to bring in debt financing to that. And so, yeah, we're looking at a whole host of different things. We're always looking at the market to see, are there opportunities to optimize our capital structure in any way? So for sure. So at the project level, we look at, kind of the typical stuff, whether it's project financing, it could be different structures of that project financing, longer tenor, shorter tenor, different types of financial institutions. And again, depending on the project, it'll be better suited for one or another. We look at project bonds, infrastructure bonds. So we look at a whole host of different financing instruments, and then at the corporate level, the same. I think we're constantly looking for, again, how do we optimize our company in the best way we can, and part of that is optimizing the capital structure. And so debt instruments of all types we do look at.
Thank you very much, Ucho. Thank you very much for everyone that joined the roundtable. Thank you for the three speakers. It was really interesting, and I really appreciate your information. Your time was really good to be part of this. Thank you, Atlas, for the idea. So thank you, everyone, and also for those ones who send questions. We will try to answer after the roundtable, so don't worry about that. So thank you, everyone. That was really good.
Thank you, guys.
I wait for you here in Argentina. See you.